Today is early January 8th, 2023. I usually do videos Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, but because of this announcement by the United States of this very significant military package to Ukraine, at least relative to what they have been sending for the last couple of months, I decided to bump the video up and do it a little early. And before I get started, I just want to tell my audience again that if you are looking for daily coverage of the conflict in Ukraine and other geopolitical issues, I highly recommend the Duran. I also recommend the individual channels of Alex Christoforou and Alexander Makuris. They do an excellent job covering not only the conflict in Ukraine, but any other geopolitical development taking place around the globe. So I'll put the links to all of those in the video description below. In case you're waiting for another one of my videos to come out, you can go over to their channel and they do excellent coverage. What I want to do in this video is dig into this announcement. So let's look at this from the US Department of Defense: more than $3 billion in additional security assistance for Ukraine. This is dated January 6, 2023. And as you can see down here, there is quite an extensive list of weapon systems, ammunition, and other equipment being prepared to be sent to Ukraine. Now, let's go over the items on this list and let's break it down. It looks like a lot, but is it a lot relative to what Ukraine actually needs to not only replace its losses and sustain its current fighting capacity, but increase it in order to outmatch Russian forces? So the first item on the list is 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles with 500 TOW anti-tank missiles and 250,000 rounds 25mm ammunition. So the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, I've talked about this in my previous update. It has relatively light armor compared to a main battle tank or even in the light tank, wheeled tank that France is sending, the AMX-10 RC. And what it's actually supposed to do is help provide protection for infantry as they move onto the battlefield. They're designed to keep up with tanks. The US is not currently sending tanks to Ukraine. None of their allies are sending any tanks anytime soon. So these are just going to be on the battlefield by themselves, and that is not what they are designed to do. And they have this 25mm gun that provides supporting fire for the infantry after they dismount, and you have the TOW missile launchers on these Bradley tanks with 500 TOW missiles. Now, you hear 500 TOW missiles, and if you don't know what's going on and you're buying into whatever the Western media is telling you, you might think, wow, 500 TOW missiles, that's 500 Russian tanks gone. It's not. And I've talked about this study published by the US Army, Fort Benning, Infantry Brigade, Combat Team, Scout Platoon, anti-armor engagements at the Joint Readiness Training Center. And this study talks about how under training conditions with fully trained US forces, they have about a 19% hit rate with various types of anti-tank weapons, the TOW missile, Javelin, other anti-tank weapons that they are using. It averages out to about 19% just to get a hit, not destroy, just to record a hit. That is under training conditions with properly trained US forces. Ukrainian troops without proper training and under wartime conditions, the percentage is going to be even less. Now, 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. What does that amount to in terms of military units on the field? So I want to show you this first, this diagram here. This is of an Army mechanized infantry platoon. So one platoon is 4 Bradley fighting vehicles, which means you can create about 12 platoons. You can create 12 platoons, and you need 3 platoons to create a company. So let's look at this diagram here. This is the Armored Brigade Combat Team. This is how the United States organizes the U.S. Army around brigades. There are units about 4,000 strong. Ukrainian brigades are also roughly around that size. Well, on paper, they're supposed to be that size. And when you see rifle company, they're talking about mechanized rifle companies with Bradley vehicles. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You also have a large number of Bradleys in each cavalry troop. And when you add all of this up, it's well over 100 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. So 50 is not even half of a brigade. It's not even half of what you would need to create a single brigade. So I have heard Western analysts talk about how the West is going to help Ukraine reconstitute, rebuild, or stand up new brigades. That is a fantasy. They are not even going to be replacing what they have lost. Remember the Kherson offensive alone, not even talking about the Kharkov offensive. The Kherson offensive alone, Ukraine lost brigades, multiple brigades worth of men and machines, including infantry fighting vehicles, main battle tanks, and armored personnel carriers. Well, that is the next item on the list, 100 M113 armored personnel carriers. These are antiquated. They have extremely light armor. And between the Bradley and the M113, virtually anything larger than small arms fire can punch holes in these vehicles and destroy them. So some large caliber machine guns, virtually every gun on Russian infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, any Russian tank, artillery fire, rocket propelled grenades, these loitering munitions, the Lancet drone, that can destroy either a Bradley or an M113. And we've seen many examples of M113s and related vehicles sent by the West to Ukraine being destroyed by these Lancet drones. So this is what awaits the Bradley as it rolls into Ukraine. But let's get back to how Ukraine is going to use these. So I showed you this diagram. The headquarters, actually, when you have a company, so you have 3 platoons and then you have 1 headquarters unit, and they will have maybe 2 Bradley fighting vehicles, they'll have Humvees, and they'll have something like an M113, and it's playing a supporting role. They'll usually modify it. You could use them as armored ambulances, lightly armored ambulances. That's what the M113 does. So it is not a replacement for the armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and certainly not the main battle tanks that Ukraine was using, has now lost, and is not getting replacements for. Next on the list is 55 mine resistance ambush protected vehicles. Again, they have the same problem as the M113 and the Bradleys. They have light armor, can protect against some small arms fire, but virtually everything else that Russia is using on the battlefield will punch holes in it and destroy it. 138 high mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles. They're talking about Humvees. Again, these are simply because Ukraine does not have any vehicles at all of anything left. They're sending these. These are not heavily armored. Some of them are not armored at all. Depends on which ones the US is sending, how they've been modified. But at best, they can stop small arms fire, and everything from heavy machine guns up to every tank fire, artillery, and everything else Russia has will completely destroy these. And they have been destroying these because the US has been sending hundreds and hundreds of these, and they continue sending them because they continue being destroyed. So that Ukraine is not building up an army. They are not even coming close to replacing their losses, even with tranches this big. Next on the list, it says 18 155 millimeter self-propelled howitzers and 18 ammunition support vehicles. So 1 vehicle per howitzer, self-propelled howitzer. These are the M109 Paladins. US allies have sent up, I think, around 50 of these already, and this 18 doesn't even come close to replacing the amount of M109s that Ukraine has had and then lost because Russia has destroyed them. And This is another system, even though it looks like a tank, it does not have heavy armor, and a system like the Lancet drone can find it and destroy it with relative ease. So between the about 50 that NATO altogether has sent Ukraine already, plus the 18 that's over 60, how quickly can you replace these? How quickly can the US military-industrial complex push out these self-propelled howitzers, since artillery is such a key component of this conflict? This is from Defense News. US Army awards BAE contract to build full-rate production howitzers. And if you come down here, the maximum rate of production in this contract is 60 per year. So you need to keep large numbers of these on the battlefield. Russia is able to remove them off the battlefield faster than BAE can produce them. This is a constant problem that Ukraine and its Western sponsors have, that in the Western media, they have begun acknowledging this. This is about industrial warfare. Russia has a massive military-industrial complex and capacity to replace its losses. It is not losing as much as Ukraine is, and the West does not. And in order for BAE to expand their production, or for any defense contractor in the West to expand production, to make more artillery shells, or rockets, or vehicles, it takes years to retool and expand the factory. Sometimes you have to expand the physical space of the factory, an extension onto the factory, fill it up with machines, get personnel to move in. That takes years to do. So this is not something that can be fixed anytime soon. Also on the list, this is part of this package, 70,155 millimeter artillery rounds. That's about 11 days at 6,000 rounds per day, which is what Ukraine itself and the Western media claims Ukraine is firing in terms of artillery every single day. So that's 11 days. And if you've been following these updates, you know that the US does not send conventional 155 millimeter artillery shells more than one time a month, sometimes less than that even. And again, because they cannot produce enough, I think it's at 15,000 shells per month. That is the production rate, and Ukraine can go through that in 2 or 3 days. So you can see the problem here. Next on the list, 500 precision-guided 155 millimeter artillery rounds. These are the GPS-guided Excalibur rounds. I've shown you in previous updates the Raytheon website, which claims one GPS-guided round is worth 10 conventional rounds. In other words, the precision that it gives you, normally you'd have to fire 10 rounds to hit the target and destroy it, whereas with the Excalibur, you just use 1 round. But 500 times 10 is 5,000. That's not even a single day's worth of ammunition for Ukraine's artillery. There's 1,200 155 millimeter rounds of remote anti-armor mine systems, 36 105 millimeter towed howitzers, and 95,000 105 millimeter artillery rounds, because the US is not able to send more M777s, and the West in general is having a very hard time finding and sending additional artillery systems. They're sending the smaller caliber 105 system. It's got a smaller caliber, it shoots a shorter distance, and we're talking about a conflict where Ukraine's whole problem this entire time has been Russia's overabundance of long-range weapons, many of them precision weapons, but also their artillery. Russia has many different types of artillery systems, and they have a lot of each type of artillery system. So Ukraine's whole problem is that they've been outranged and outgunned, and you're sending them these smaller guns. Why? Because they don't have anything else to send them. They don't have things to send Ukraine that they actually need. This is all that they have. That's why they're sending it. 10,000 120 millimeter mortar rounds. And when you hear these numbers regarding ammunition, they sound like very large numbers, but I've explained many times in the past how many rounds you actually need to fire. in an armed conflict to actually achieve anything. There are huge quantities of ammunition required, and these are not actually very large quantities. I can guarantee you Ukraine needs many times more of everything that you see on this list, just to match Russia. Additional ammunition for the high mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS. They never talk about the quantity, but they do admit that they are running low on these, that Ukraine uses way more than the US would suggest that they use, and way more than the US can continue supplying them. So there's also RIM-7 missiles for air defense. This is another short-range air defense system that they're scraping together anything they can find to send to Ukraine. Ukraine had excellent Soviet-era air defense systems. This has actually shaped the way this conflict has unfolded. Russia has to use its military aviation in a very specific and cautious way because of that Soviet-era air defense. But now that they're breaking down, they need spare parts they cannot find. They need additional munitions, missiles to fire with them. They cannot find them. They cannot make them. They depend on the West for air defense systems. The West has always depended on air superiority, using warplanes to achieve air superiority over a battlefield. They do have air defense systems, but it is something they admit themselves they have not invested in to the extent Russia has. They admit, Western analysts admit, Russia has the best air defense systems in the world. So when you see them scraping together all of these different systems and sending them to Ukraine, it's because they don't have a single solid system or a series of solid systems in large numbers that they can send to Ukraine. They are incapable of replacing Ukraine's depleted Soviet-era air defense systems. 4,000 Zuni aircraft rockets. There are unguided versions of these. There are also laser-guided versions of these. Russia has its own equivalent of these, both unguided and guided rockets. They're fired from aircraft. Okay, so what air force is Ukraine using these with? They have a very tiny number of warplanes left, and if you give them these rockets, they will feel obliged to use them, and every time they go up in the air to try to do close air support, they're going to be exposed to Russian air defense, and it will only accelerate the complete depletion of Ukrainian air power. Now, there is the possibility that they could be trying to do some sort of ground-launched version of this. This is a BAE weapon. Maybe the US is trying to transfer something like this to Ukraine. We'll just have to wait and see. They also say approximately 2,000 anti-armor rockets, and there's no details as to what this is. I will dig around and try to figure out what they're talking about, but let's assume that it's anti-tank missiles. That's what they meant to say, and they're talking about something like the Javelin or TOW or whatever else they have laying around, some antiquated system in storage that they're going to pull out and restore and send. I don't know. Have to wait and see the details that come out. But again, 2,000 rounds. Remember, 2,000 rounds, 19% chance of hitting, just even hitting the target, not even talking about damaging or destroying it. A 19% chance. US forces properly trained under training conditions. For Ukraine, it'll be much less than 19%. So much less than 19% of 2,000 rounds of whatever this munition is not actually that much. Then it says sniper rifles, machine guns, and ammunition for grenade launchers and small arms, Claymore anti-personnel munitions. Well, they say munitions, they are mines. They are land mines for killing people. Night vision, devices and optics, spare parts, and other field equipment. And if you add all of this together, this entire package, it is not enough to stand up even a single brigade. What they're going to do, and again, remember, Ukraine has lost multiple brigades trying to take Kherson, and also, to a lesser extent, Kharkov. They're not going to be able to stand up even a single brigade with all of this equipment. They would need several of these over the next couple of months, the same size or larger, to do that. What they will try to do is stretch this over several existing brigades. They will try to replenish some of the more elite units within these brigades. They're going to try to prevent some of these brigades from just completely unraveling and more or less being deactivated because there's nothing left for them. That is what they're trying to do here. So they're extending the conflict. They are doing absolutely nothing even remotely close to what is needed to change the outcome of this conflict. Speaking of the Duran, I was listening to a recent update by Alex Christoforou, and in it he was asking the question, why is the West sending armored vehicles to Ukraine? Infantry fighting vehicles, now there's talk about sending main battle tanks. Why is this even necessary? Because we were told by open source intelligence, which was repeated all across the Western media, that Ukraine was doing such a great job fighting Russia, that they were capturing huge numbers of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, even air defense systems, and that this was going to give them an even larger tank force today than they started the special military operation out with in late February. That clearly is not true. None of that is true. Russia has, in reality, been destroying all of Ukraine's armored vehicles, from main battle tanks down to just the daily transportation, the Ukrainian equivalent of a Humvee and everything in between. And they need more because they are out. They are out of everything. The U.S. and its allies initially tried to replace what Ukraine was losing with Soviet-era systems that they found all throughout Eastern Europe. They are out of that. Now, the only thing left for them to do is either leave Ukraine on the battlefield with no armor at all, or start sending them Western armor, no matter how inappropriate and no matter how inefficient it's going to be. They will not be able to effectively use this on the battlefield, and they will have these huge problems linked to logistics, sustainment, and most of all, maintenance. I want to point out this article from the New York Times. I pointed this one out before. Artillery is breaking in Ukraine. It's becoming a problem for the Pentagon. Ukrainian soldiers are firing thousands of shells daily, forcing the U.S. to replace gun barrels across the border in Poland. And we've already heard stories. I mean, that goes for artillery, but that goes for all of these systems the West is sending Ukraine, including these Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the French AMX-10 RC, the German Mauder, and any of these main battle tanks they're considering sending. Just through regular use, they have serious maintenance issues and requirements. But Ukraine is not going to be using them day to day as the US or Germany or France were using them in training, but also, say, in the invasion of Iraq or the occupation of Afghanistan. Ukraine is going to be using them under much harsher conditions. They'll be using them harder, pushing them harder day to day, and they will be up against threats many times more dangerous than anything the US, the French, the Germans have been up against in the 21st century across the multiple interventions that they've been involved in. Now, I've talked about what happens when they break down, and it could be anything that breaks down. One of the advantages that Western armor will give Ukraine is modern sights that can see in the dark, infrared sights that can see, under any condition, weather condition, battlefield condition. The fire control on these systems are using computers. They're sophisticated, relatively sophisticated. This makes them accurate. Keep in mind that Russia has all of these systems also. But if it breaks, Ukraine is not going to be able to fix it. And they cannot create a repair facility anywhere in Ukraine because Russia is able to hit literally anywhere in Ukraine with cruise missiles. If they set up a maintenance center, Russia finds it, they will fire a cruise missile or send Garand 2 drones to destroy it. Which is why in that New York Times article, they're talking about bringing the artillery pieces to Poland. And they bring a lot of other equipment the West has sent Ukraine to Poland because that's the only safe place it can be repaired. So you are taking these systems off the front line and sending them 1,000 kilometers to the Polish border to be repaired. And then they have to travel 1,000 kilometers back. Keep in mind that Russia is targeting and destroying Ukraine's power grid. The rail system runs mostly on electricity. So you can see the problems that are building up. This is an accumulative negative problem that is building up for Ukrainian forces. Russia does not have this problem. All they have to do is make sure their maintenance facilities are far enough away from the front line to avoid HIMARS strikes. And that's it. So essentially what the US is trying to do is build an entirely new army for Ukraine in the middle of a war. And they're using all of this equipment that under normal conditions, if you wanted Ukraine to begin using Western main battle tanks or Western infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, this is a process that normally takes years to do, between setting up the infrastructure to support and sustain it in combat, to training and training how to operate it, but also training how to use it in combined arms warfare. You cannot accelerate this process. There's a reason why countries spend years incorporating new weapon systems. This is the same thing they did in Syria. They tried to build an army out of thin air. They were getting all of these militants, sending them to Jordan, sending them to Turkey, sending them all across the Middle East to train, arm them, equip them, and send them back, wearing uniforms with vehicles provided to them by the West. And they sent them into Syria to fight the Syrian Arab Army, which is an existing army, a well-organized army. And they have the institutional ability to wage combined arms warfare. You are not going to create an army in the middle of a proxy conflict that will be able to ever match an existing organized army, not the Syrian Arab Army and certainly not the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Now this Department of Defense press release says, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and other armored vehicles and artillery systems will complement the recent commitment of combat vehicles to Ukraine by Germany and France. You have vehicles from the US, vehicles from France, vehicles from Germany. So you have all these vehicles from different countries. They'll have different training requirements, different maintenance requirements, different ammunition requirements. So this is the reason why armies standardize. And if you look at what the US and also Russia and also China are trying to do, they're trying to standardize as much as possible. So they'll have an armored vehicle platform that they will create armored personnel carriers out of, infantry fighting vehicles out of, and even sometimes tanks out of. They all serve different roles on the battlefield, so they have their own specific requirements that you have to design and develop. But they want these systems to share as many common components and parts and ammunition as possible, so that you take the burden off of training and logistics, sustainment and maintenance. They're doing the exact opposite for Ukraine. They are complicating it out of necessity to the extreme. You cannot build an effective army this way at any time. You certainly cannot do it in the middle of a war. And it's very clear Ukraine is not building an army in the middle of this conflict. They are not even replacing their losses. This is why Ukraine's offensives have stalled. They're not making any progress at all. Their forces are admittedly stretched thin, and they are losing ground in Bakhmut and around Bakhmut. Now, if they were a force that was gradually growing stronger because of all of this US aid, US and European aid, they would not be losing ground around Bakhmut, but they are, because there's a negative accumulative effect of replacing all of this equipment that you had in late February. A very large number, I'm talking hundreds of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers. You had hundreds of those. You were familiar with them. You had the infrastructure to support and sustain them in combat. And now you're replacing them with systems you have no ability to do that with. So it is better than nothing, but just barely. And you cannot even maintain your fighting capacity, let alone exceed it sufficiently to match or overpower the Russian forces. All the US and its allies know how to do is escalate. No matter how irrational, no matter how illogical, that is all they know how to do, escalate. There is no exit ramp for the US and its allies. There is no exit ramp in Ukraine for the US and their allies. They are going to perpetuate this for as long as possible, for as long as profitable. I can guarantee you that there are going to be some arms manufacturers in the West that are going to have huge backfill orders because of all these armored vehicles they're now sending to Ukraine. But they are not going to change the outcome of the conflict. They're just going to draw it out for as long as possible. They will get many more Ukrainians and also Russians killed. They will continue to grind down Ukraine as a nation state, its economy already obliterated, and they will put off any chance of recovery for years to come by pushing this for as long as possible. That's all they know how to do. Just like in Syria, Russia will have to work hard to prevent the US from dangerously escalating this into direct combat with Russia, or trying to change the battlefield so drastically that it does threaten to spiral out of control. They did this in Syria successfully. They're going to obviously be trying to do this in Ukraine. It is a slow grind. It is a war of attrition. I highly recommend people read this. From Russia Matters. This is from the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center. This is a pro-Western platform. What's Ahead in the War in Ukraine by Alex Vershinin. And if we scroll down, we will see what are his qualifications. He is a U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, retired after 20 years of service, including 8 years as an armor officer with 4 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and 12 years working as a modeling and simulations officer in NATO and U.S. Army concept development and experimentation. This includes a tour with the U.S. Army Sustainment Battle Lab, where he led the experimentation scenario team. So he is someone who is well qualified to do this type of analysis. He is basically coming to the same conclusions that I and many others have. Anyone who's looking at this objectively, Russia is settling in for a war of attrition. They have a massive military industrial capacity behind them, and their goal is simply to destroy more of Ukraine's forces than they themselves lose. And that is exactly what's happening. That is what is going to continue happening. And there's nothing the West can do to change that equation. The final paragraph here. Wars of attrition are won through careful husbandry of one's own resources while destroying the enemy's. Russia entered the war with vast material superiority and a greater industrial base to sustain and replace losses. They have carefully preserved their resources, withdrawing every time the tactical situation turned against them. Ukraine started the war with a smaller resource pool and relied on the Western coalition to sustain its war effort. This dependency pressured Ukraine into a series of tactically successful offensives, which consumed strategic resources that Ukraine will struggle to replace in full, in my view. The real question isn't whether Ukraine can regain all of its territory, but whether it can inflict sufficient losses on Russian mobilized reservists to undermine Russia's domestic unity, forcing it to the negotiation table on Ukrainian terms, or will Russia's attrition strategy work to annex an even larger portion of Ukraine? And what this reveals is that Russia is winning tactically, strategically. Ukraine is playing a political game. It is extremely unlikely that Ukraine can do anything to politically undermine Russian military operations in Ukraine. Russia has tremendous perseverance. They will persevere. Anyway, that does it for this update. I have another video coming on Wednesday, and then another one on Friday. And if anything major happens in between, I will do an additional video. I will be doing live streams again, not this coming Friday, but the Friday after that with Angelo Giuliano, my friend and colleague. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my YouTube videos are uploaded automatically to Rumble and Odyssey. They'll show up in a day or two, but they will show up. Auto-generated subtitles for my YouTube videos, they will show up in a day or two. Please be patient. I know that it's important for many people out there. watching these videos. In the video description below will be all of the links that I referenced in this video, including some reports that I didn't actually mention, but it provides information about how the U.S. structures its military and the U.S. Army specifically, and how the Bradley fighting vehicle is used. And you can see how small of a number 50 is when trying to create even the most basic units on the battlefield. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize YouTube. If an ad pops up, please feel free to block it or skip it. It's not doing me any good at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. And it is because of my audience supporting my work either through monthly donations or one-time donations, or even just sharing my work with others. That is the reason I am able to continue doing this. So thank you so much. And as always, thank you for watching.